South Africa currently has a three-tiered system of government, but are the 9 provinces in South Africa fully empowered to effect significant change in terms of governance and economic development? How is the constitutional structure constraining or empowering the provinces to fully represent the interests of citizens? Well, joining me to discuss this is Richard Wilkinson, who's an attorney and somebody who spent a lot of time looking at provincial powers in South Africa. Richard, welcome to Solutions with David Ansara.
Thank you, David.
So Richard, let's start off by talking about the existing institutional framework in South Africa in terms of the structure of government. It seems that the constitutional negotiations resulted in almost like a quasi-federal system, but in practice what we have is quite high levels of concentration of power and centralisation in Pretoria. Could you give us an overview of how you view the current institutional framework in SA?
Yeah, David, there's the theory of constitutional law, and then there's the practical reality of what's happened in the last 25 years. I think we've got to keep that on a split screen. You're absolutely correct. The practical reality is that South Africa has been governed at a national level by the ANC without any change of government for the last 27 years. But we do, on paper, we've got a three-tiered system of government. We've got 3 spheres of government: the national sphere, the provincial sphere, and the local sphere. And my focus has been on researching the provincial sphere of government and trying to understand what provinces can and can't do. And provinces actually have extensive legislative powers, which have not been exercised to their fullest extent. And very simply, the 4th schedule of the National Constitution provides for a list of 33 concurrent functions of government. And what that means is that there are 33 areas where both national and the provincial spheres of government can legislate. This includes stuff like healthcare services, welfare services, education, agriculture, tourism, consumer protection, trade, industrial promotion, and a number of other areas. And what that means is that you can have national legislation and provincial legislation in the same function of government. For example, road traffic regulation is a function of government that's contained in Schedule 4. And so you can have a National Road Traffic Regulation Act, and you can also have a Gauteng Road Traffic Regulation Act or a Western Cape Road Traffic Regulation Act. And the Constitution does not give automatic primacy to either national law or provincial law. It's possible for the 2 legislative arrangements to conflict with each other. And if they do conflict with each other, then the Constitution regulates the circumstances in which provincial legislation will prevail over national legislation, and vice versa, where national legislation will prevail over provincial legislation. And we can go into that in a bit of detail. There are effectively 10 overrides that the national government has at its disposal. And the Constitutional Court will determine which legislative framework prevails in any particular circumstance. They will look at all of the facts and circumstances of that conflict. We haven't had a case go to the Constitutional Court yet where there's been conflicts between national and provincial legislation. That just hasn't happened. The Western Cape has got one big piece of legislation they've got through in 2010, the Western Cape Education Act. But in general, they haven't done a full legislative program across all 33 concurrent functions of government. And so there certainly is scope for provincial governments to pass legislation that conflicts with and potentially prevails over national legislation.
Right, Richard. So one question is around allocation of financial resources. So National Treasury currently allocates about 95% of all provinces' spending allocations to the provinces. So, and I think the other 5% on average is from gambling taxes and liquor licenses and so on. How does that constrain the ability of provinces to really differentiate themselves in terms of the kinds of policies that they can set and the way in which service delivery is conducted?
Yeah, look, I mean, provinces are restrained in terms of their fiscal powers. They don't have major tax raising powers, and they are very much dependent on the national government for their divisional share of revenue. And so that's not been an area that I've studied in great detail. You essentially get allocated a lump sum of money each year, and the province has got some leeway over how they spend it, right? So they can decide whether they're going to allocate 36% of it to health or 34% to health, and maybe spend some more on education. That's not something I've put a lot of time into, and I don't think that is an area which is particularly interesting because the province's powers are so restrained. So my area of focus has been specifically on legislation, and it's a good point, David, because if you want to do something as a province, you need a budget to do it, and you also need the authority to do it, right? You need to have the legislative authority. And so I can talk about legislative authority, but there's no point going on and doing something if you don't have the budget to do it. And if you don't have original fiscal powers, it's not even worth discussing budgets if you don't have control over fiscal policy, unless you want to, move budgets around between the different departments. So my area of interest has been specifically on deregulation, because deregulation doesn't require a budget. If you've got laws that are getting in the way of private enterprise, if you can pass provincial legislation that effectively simplifies or repeals laws that are inhibiting investment, then that doesn't require a budget. That's just purely a deregulation-based agenda. And so that is kind of the box you get pushed into as a province. But I do think that there is potential for some very interesting work to be done there.
Right, Richard. So, I mean, when we look at the 9 provinces in South Africa, the one that stands out is the Western Cape. It's the only province that's currently run by an opposition party or a party other than the ANC. Do you think, looking at the last 10 years or so of DA governance in the province, that they have fully exercised some of the powers that are available to them and been able to sufficiently differentiate themselves from national policy?
The short answer is no. I think there's an enormous amount of work that can be done in this area. I did work on it full time for about 6 months, and you quickly develop an appreciation for how much research and work needs to be done before you can actually take on an assignment in this area. It is easier said than done. For example, if you were to take something like healthcare services, or even something simpler like road traffic regulation, you'd need to study the national legislative framework quite closely and ask yourself, what exactly do you have a problem with? Because a lot of the stuff that national parliament passes, the DA is actually okay with. I mean, for example, the National Road Traffic Regulation Act is a law that was passed years ago. You'd have to go through every section of that and ask yourself, are you happy with what is the current status quo? When it comes to national road traffic regulation, I mean, you could ask yourself, do you want to change the speed limit in the province, or do you want to change the blood alcohol level? The blood alcohol level is currently 0.05 milligrams per liter, or whatever it is. You might want to make that 0, or you might want to increase it. And if you did that, then you would have a conflict of law, right? So the province has got the legislative authority to pass a Western Cape Road Traffic Regulation Act, or a Gauteng Road Traffic Regulation Act. And you're absolutely right. There's no prospect of any of the other 8 provinces doing anything, because they're all governed by the same party that implements the same policies. So I can't see Gauteng really trying to change anything here. But if the Western Cape wanted to reduce the blood alcohol level to 0, they could do that. But you've got to ask yourself, do you actually want to do that? Is this actually DA policy? And the more you look at it, the more you realize that there are fairly limited areas where you can deregulate without requiring an enormous budget or requiring the cooperation of the national government. And the area that I settled on was housing. I thought that housing law in South Africa is really quite damaging to private sector investment. We make it very difficult to evict people who don't pay their rent. And so what's happened is that there's been a massive constriction in the supply of private sector rental housing, which places an additional burden on the government to build houses for everybody. And so that became an area of interest for me. But you can go through every single one of these concurrent functions of government and ask yourself, what is the status quo? And are there areas where we think there needs to be a change? And there are some sweeping concurrent functions of government. For example, one of them is trade. Trade is not defined in the Constitution, but it's an interesting area. It potentially opens up the whole world of commercial activity. And, for example, in healthcare services, there's the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, the pharmaceutical industry is another area where there were fireworks about 20 years ago. And I'm not sure if anyone's really done the research and done the work and actually figured out, is there something we can change? And if we can change it, does it fit our policy agenda to actually do it? Does it fit in with what the DA actually wants to do in government? So it's quite hard to get that all to align, but in short, there is enormous scope for legislative work to be done at a provincial level.
In terms of the Constitution, Schedule 4 and 5 outlines those exclusive competencies and those shared competencies, as you mentioned earlier.
Yeah. So just briefly, Schedule 4 and Schedule 5, the fourth schedule sets out the concurrent competences. And there's some pretty meaty things there. There's education at a primary and secondary level, but not tertiary level. There's healthcare services, there's tourism, a number of really big concurrent functions of government, agriculture. And then there's Schedule 5, which gives exclusive competence to the province in certain areas. And with respect, that one's a bit more of a joke. I think alcohol, liquor licensing is in Schedule 5. Some of the other stuff in Schedule 5 is like dog pounds and fencing and street lighting. It's stuff that's not going to excite anybody. So your focus needs to be on Schedule 4, which is the concurrent functions of government. And then you need to, so you've got authority to pass law across the whole of healthcare services, which is a big area. And then you need to conflict with national legislation. And then you need to prevail over national legislation in terms of the 10 overrides. So, for example, if you decided, and I'm not proposing this, but it's just an idea, but if somebody decided they wanted to amend the law on termination of pregnancy, which is abortion, that would probably fall within healthcare services. I think it almost certainly would fall within healthcare services. And then you can pass provincial legislation that would conflict with national legislation. And that's, once you get to the point where you've got a conflict of law, that's where the exciting stuff happens in terms of the 10 overrides. Yeah.
Okay. And historically, the DA has been quite reluctant to push that edge in terms of inciting a kind of a conflict with national government. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think, look, it just hasn't happened. I mean, the big thing they achieved was the Western Cape Education Act of 2010. And I think that was one of Helen Zille's priorities, having been a former Minister of Education in the Western Cape back in 1999. I'm not sure, I'm not closely affiliated with the Western Cape government or the DA, so I'm not sure what their legislative agenda is at the moment. But what we haven't seen, certainly in the first 5-10 years of the first and second term of Helen Zille's administration, we didn't see tons of legislation coming through the provincial parliament. And if you sat down with the Western Cape Minister of Agriculture or the Western Cape Minister of Arts and Culture and said, what's your legislative agenda? I doubt you would get an enormous amount of content out of them. Why is that the case? Well, I think it's quite hard work. The stuff takes research. If you're the Western Cape Minister of Arts and Culture, there is work to be done in terms of African customary law. I think that national African customary law is stuff that the DA would probably not agree with. The Communal Land Rights Act, the Traditional Courts Bill, the law of succession in African customary law. A lot of the stuff that's gone through there has been really illiberal, and it prejudices the rights of rural women in particular. The Communal Land Rights Act, there'd be a bit of a debate about whether that falls within the function of land, which is outside of the provincial concurrent competences, or whether it falls within African customary law, in which case it would fall within culture and customary law. But I haven't done this, and I would be interested to see what would happen. But if you sat down with each of the 10 provincial ministers and said, what's your legislative program? It'd be interesting to see what they said. It hasn't been done because I think it is a lot of work producing legislation, and they've got limited resources in the Western Cape, and people have to prioritize what they're going to do. And from a political perspective, you've got to decide, you've got to pick your battles as well. I mean, do you really want to get into a fight over the blood alcohol level on the Western Cape's roads? Is that a national priority right now? Do you want to start reforming African customary law? Do you even want to reform the law of termination of pregnancy? So it's a lot of work. It takes a lot of research. You are constrained from a fiscal perspective. The only thing you can really do is deregulate or change the law. But you can't take on expansive programs that require original fiscal funding. And that, I think, is the situation that they're in. But I would certainly be interested to see them, and I would encourage them to take a more expansive approach in a number of areas. Yeah.
What we are seeing, though, Richard, at the national level, the DA in Parliament, in the National Assembly, has put forward a private member's bill requesting an amendment to the Referendums Act. And that seems to be a push towards the ability for the party at the provincial level to be able to initiate referenda and to directly ask the Western Cape populace about specific key policy issues. What is behind that? What exactly are they requesting, and how do you see this playing out?
Right, this is really interesting, and this is something separate to what we've spent the last couple of minutes discussing. A provincial referendum, quite simply, or a national referendum, is where every registered voter in the province would be invited to go to the polling stations on a particular date and vote on a particular question. So you're not voting for a political party. Instead, you're answering a question that is put to you, normally with a yes or no answer. And the last time South Africans went to the polls, although it was only white citizens who did this, was in 1992, when F.W. de Klerk called a national referendum, effectively asking people whether they approved of his reform process in which he was dismantling apartheid and moving towards a constitutional democracy. And I think 69% of people voted yes. So this is something that in the fully democratic era, South Africans have not had experience in. But the national constitution does provide for referendums to be called, firstly by the president on a national level. So President Ramaphosa has the constitutional authority to call a referendum on virtually any question. And that could be on any question. I mean, it could be, do you think we should legalize marijuana? That's a valid question. Do you think we should increase the voting age to 21? I mean, he could call it on any question he wants. But the national constitution and the provincial constitution also provide for the premier to call provincial referendums. And this is something that has not been tried before, and I think it's a long forgotten section of the constitution. But the premier is entitled to call referendums, but he must do so in accordance with national legislation. And that is the caveat that has sort of put the fly in the ointment here for the DA. The DA has expressed interest in the Western Cape being able to call provincial referendums. But there is no enabling legislation at the moment at a national level that would allow them to do so. So the Constitution says that the Premier may call a referendum in accordance with national legislation. The national legislation we have dates back to 1983. It's called the Referendums Act, and it allows the President to call a national referendum, but it makes no mention of provinces or the Premiers because it was passed in 1983, long before the new Constitution or before we entered into this three-tiered system of government. So what the DA wants and what they are introducing in Parliament now is an amendment to the Referendums Act, which is going to empower the provinces or the premiers of the provinces to call referendums. And in an ideal world, as far as the DA is concerned, the National Parliament will enact this law. It will amend the Referendums Act, and Premier Alan Winde will then have the constitutional and the legislative authority to call his referendums, and they can then go ahead and call referendums. They're focusing on three areas: control over urban rail transport, control over the police, and control over electricity and energy production. So we haven't got full details on exactly what they intend to do, but it's very interesting because it would certainly usher in an era of potentially direct democracy where the people of a province get to have an actual say on issues of public policy. And I think trains, police, and electricity are very, very topical issues that are affecting everybody. It's affecting a broad spectrum of people. But it also raises interesting political issues as well. And we'd have to wait and see what the ANC's reaction is to this. I sense it probably won't be positive. The DA might end up having to go to the Constitutional Court to effectively force Parliament to pass legislation. We can't speculate too early. We have to wait and see what happens. And there's also a risk that the ANC and the EFF might decide to change the Constitution to take away this power altogether. But that's what lies in the future of the next couple of months.
And you mentioned policing, Richard, and in 2012, Premier Helen Zille initiated the Khayelitsha Commission of Inquiry into policing in Cape Town. And after reports of police incompetence and underfunding of of Western Cape policing. That was then challenged by the SAPS. That went to the Constitutional Court, and eventually that was green lighted. Former Justice O'Regan and Vusi Pukoli, the former Director of Public Prosecutions, were able to conduct their work. And the results of that inquiry were quite damning. And I think the lack of control and power that local representatives have over local police structures, I think, has resulted in huge issues with safety and security in the province.
Absolutely. I mean, this is, again, a slightly different area of law. This has got to do with the Premier being able to call commissions of inquiry, which sits right next to the referendum provision in the Constitution. And that is what Helen Zille did in 2012. It's important to emphasize that the South African Police Service is managed centrally by the national government. There is no such thing as the Western Cape Police Service. It doesn't exist. The Western Cape's constitutional authority in respect of policing is limited to oversight. So they're entitled to monitor and engage with provincial police, with the provincial division of the South African Police Service. But I think the DA wants a bit more than that now. I think, judging by their press statement, what they would like is for control over the police to be transferred to the Western Cape government. Now, I obviously don't speak on behalf of the Western Cape government or the DA, so you'd need to ask them directly. But I think that's more or less the strategy they are proposing. And so I think what they'd want to do is call this provincial referendum. And one of the questions would be, do you support transferring control of policing and the SAPS from the national government to the provincial government? And then, provided the enabling legislation is passed, which is a big if, and there's a lot of politics that needs to happen before that law ever gets passed, the Premier would be authorized to call that referendum. The people of the Western Cape would go and vote, and they'd be faced with a yes or no question. Do you support transferring control of the SAPS to the provincial government? And it would be very interesting to see what that outcome is. If you assume that DA voters would support that, and I think that's a fair assumption to make, then my personal guess, and it's only a guess, is that you'd be looking at a positive result of over 60%, I would think, of the Western Cape's population probably voting in favor of that question. There is no legal impact. There's no binding legal effect of a referendum. It's important to stress that. When FW de Klerk called his referendum, it's really just advisory. But from a political perspective, these things take on a life of their own, and it becomes very difficult to defy the will of the people, especially if it is expressed with a resounding majority. If a large majority of people vote for trains and police and electricity to be transferred to the province, the national government can delay and they can ignore it. But the longer they delay undertaking that, I think they would lose credibility and they would be viewed as being authoritarian. And the ANC would find itself being in the unusual position of being on the wrong side of the masses, which is something that the ANC would not have experienced very often in its history.
So, Richard, in terms of the politics of the Western Cape, the DA has been dominant for quite some time, but there are threats to its power now, both in the form of coloured nationalist groups that are beginning to emerge around kind of sectarian identity issues for the coloured community, as well as the Cape Independence Advocacy Group, which is pushing for wholesale independence of the Cape, which up until recently would have sounded like quite a far-fetched idea, but it seems to be gaining traction amongst certain quarters in the Cape. So is this a move by the DA to try and circumvent those calls and to assert more of a principles of subsidiarity and autonomy for the province to try and head off some of those calls for full-blown independence?
Yeah, no, I think you're right, David. I think just from a numbers perspective, the DA always performs best in local government elections. And in 2016, the DA was on a roll. They had Musi Mamani as their leader. He hadn't fallen out with Helen Zille yet. Zuma was still in power, and they had a brilliant local government election result. They came in with about 2/3 in the city of Cape Town, and they got about 66.6, I think, or maybe just more than 2/3. So they ended up with a 2/3 majority in the city council, which is astonishing when you consider that 10 years previously, in 2006, Helen Zille's DA only got 42% in the city council. So they've grown from 42% to 66. Every 100 kilometers you move outside of Cape Town, the DA gets progressively weaker. And so when you get to a place like Plettenberg Bay on the border with the Eastern Cape, the DA really is in a very neck and neck position with the ANC. And as you move into the Karoo, into more rural areas, the overwhelming majority of the electorate is brown or coloured, or whatever the terminology you want to use. But the DA support drops further and further. And that was back in 2016. 2019, the DA took a bit of a hit. And that was not because of Cape independence. It was because of the DA's well-publicized issues. And there were a number of smaller parties that took some votes off the DA. Specifically, Patricia de Lille came back with her own outfit called the Good Party. They didn't exactly shoot the lights out, but they took a couple of percentage points. The Freedom Front grew, the African Christian Democratic Party grew, Al-Jamar grew. Al-Jamar got a seat in the provincial parliament. So the DA came off by about 5 percentage points at a provincial level, and provincially they don't do as well as they do in the city. And what's happened since 2016 is that we have now seen the Cape Independence guys be a whole lot more active online. They have not proven themselves in an election yet. So the Cape Party is the only political party that is dedicated to Cape independence. They've been around since about 2007, and they've participated in every election since 2009. And they've never got more than about 0.5% or 1% of the provincial vote, not the national vote, just the provincial vote. So they've never broken through. Although the Cape Party has never broken through, online there's an enormous amount of activity happening in respect of Cape independence. There are two pressure groups. The one is the Cape Independence Advocacy Group, I think led by Phil Craig, and then there's another group called Cape Exit. And Cape Exit claims that to have received 800,000 online registrations. And you know, there are questions about whether that's been audited and verified. But what we can say with a high degree of confidence is that the online activity around Cape independence is bigger than ever before. And I'd put that down to general frustration during COVID, and as well as the Zondo Commission, and also the ebbing of the Ramaphoria period of South African history. And so people are getting restless, and I think the Cape independence guys are getting a bit of momentum behind that, but they have not yet proven that they can actually convert that into seats in a general election. And they will be tested in October when the Cape Party participates in the local government elections. I've got no idea what will happen, and I'm not affiliated with any of these groups. But I think the DA is sensing a bit of pressure from its right flank. The Freedom Front actually came out and said that it would support Cape independence. So the DA is, for a number of reasons, I think the DA is now pushing towards holding provincial referendums and would be interested in potentially using their legislative powers a bit more. And I think that's really where the impetus behind this latest move has come from.
Richard, let's get back to this private members bill itself.
Yeah.
What prospects for success do you think it has? Could this not just be voted down by the ANC in conjunction with the EFF, for example?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. And it's a question of numbers. And we're working off the 2019 election results. I think the ANC got 58. Well, they certainly got an outright majority. The EFF got about 11 or so. So 58 and 11 takes them to about 69. And the DA got just over 20%. So the DA is turning up to Parliament with a bill, and they're saying, well, we'd like to pass this bill. And the numbers are just not on its side. And what the DA does have going for it is that the Constitution gives constitutional authority to the Premier to call a referendum in accordance with national legislation. And so you can say that there is a constitutional obligation on Parliament to enact legislation. They can obviously debate it, and the ANC could pass their preferred version of the bill. And there's some interesting questions about whether the ANC could draft the bill in such a way that it sort of limits the Premier's powers a little bit, or curtails his authority in this area. It's too early to speculate. But the DA is going to need the ANC to agree to its bill, in short. And that might happen. The ANC might just wave this through and say, fair enough, the Constitution gives you the authority and we will support it. I don't know if that would happen. That's the first option. The second option is that the ANC will just simply refuse to pass the bill, in which case the DA or the Premier of the Western Cape would have to go to the Constitutional Court and get an order from the Constitutional Court effectively requiring Parliament to enact legislation within 12 months or within 6 months or however long the Constitutional Court would give them. And my sense is that they would probably get that order from the Constitutional Court, and the ANC would have to comply with that order, in which case they might get their bill through. And the third option is that the ANC and the EFF could team up to remove the section of the Constitution, which is something that would not go down well with the DA, but effectively the ANC could say, well, the easiest way to solve this problem is simply to amend the national constitution to take away the power of the Premier to call a referendum. If they did that, I expect the Cape Independence guys would be extremely displeased. But I don't know what more they would do. It would certainly mobilize them. But that's the situation, and we're going to have to see what happens in the coming months.
Richard, underpinning our conversation today has been this assumption that federalism is a good thing, that decentralization is beneficial. But maybe some of our viewers and listeners don't share that assumption. Why do you think that this idea of subsidiarity or devolution of power is an important one?
Yeah.
And how is it related to democratic governance?
Well, I think it's important because it allows for a pluralism of views to be expressed in a democracy. And it allows for your country to effectively develop on a number of different screens, and you can see things on a split screen basis. South Africa has been dominated by one-party rule for 30 years, and so the only province where there's been any alternative has been the Western Cape. And I think that's a pity. You know, I would have liked to have seen the IFP govern KwaZulu-Natal and to see the DA govern the Western Cape and Gauteng, and maybe there could be another party somewhere else. And then you could have a situation where there can be experimentation across large sections of government. And it's a pity that the provinces aren't afforded more power. And it's a pity that the DA isn't doing more on the legislative front. Because, right the way across government, we could be governing in a slightly different way in each province, and we can see which one works best. We've got a national education curriculum and a national matric exam. I don't think that the Western Cape has really taken this on. It would be a lot of work, but why don't we have different curriculums in different provinces with different exams? So do we have to follow a one-size-fits-all approach? If we were to change the blood alcohol level in one province, could we then not measure what impact that has on road traffic fatalities and on the burden on the healthcare system? Could the Western Cape not implement school vouchers and effectively privatize the supply of public education? Could we not be legalizing the sale of marijuana in a province? These are all interesting questions. And I think it would provide greater texture to the national debate, and it would allow people to discuss public policy more rather than discussing the same old tired themes in South African politics, which is basically identity politics and corruption. I think that's a bit stale. I think it would be nice to have a vibrant democracy with a diversity of public policy options on offer.
Yeah, Richard, I think something else that's interesting to observe is as ANC governance continues to fall short, you're having, particularly at the municipal level, communities starting to take control over the basic administration of the state, waterworks, electricity distribution, etc. So in many ways, South Africa is disaggregating, that as the ANC tries to centralize, that creates policy failure, which strengthens their desire to centralize even further. So, there are also other forces at play here where there is a natural tendency for governance to be breaking down and communities taking matters into their own hands. How do you see that playing into this discussion?
Yeah, look, that's absolutely right. You can see that on almost every level. Where government fails, you then have the emergence of privatized solutions, whether it's solar panels, private security, private education, private health. And what you're now seeing is a pushback by government against those private solutions. Governments trying to take away private healthcare, trying to regulate or frustrate efforts to install private power solutions. And this is an area where I think that, it's something that's happening on a de facto basis. You don't require legislation for this to happen. People are pressing for more and more private control and community-based control where they're taking matters into their own hands, and that doesn't require provincial legislation. But I do think that the Western Cape province, should be trying to take control of the legislative agenda so that they can protect the private sector. It requires, you need to be an expert in the different sectors to be able to speak about it fluently. But for example, pharmaceuticals, what is the situation there? Are the pharmaceutical industry over-regulated? Is the education sector over-regulated? How difficult is it to start a private school in South Africa? When it comes to agriculture, is agriculture over-regulated? The tourism industry seems to be subjected to draconian rules and regulations. A big one is disaster management. Disaster management, believe it or not, is a concurrent function of government. So the National Disaster Management Act exists and was used by the president to impose all of these lockdown conditions. There is no Western Cape Disaster Management Act, which I think is a huge failure. And I would have liked to have seen a Western Cape Disaster Management Act conflict with national legislation, potentially, not necessarily, but potentially prevailing over national legislation, so that you can protect the private sector, so that you can have the private sector enabled to effectively come up with solutions in the absence of government performance. And that sadly hasn't happened to the extent that I would have liked in the Western Cape.
Richard, when we look overseas, are there any models of countries or regions that have successfully devolved power, and what benefits has that accrued to those areas?
Yeah, there are many examples, and they're all different. South Africa doesn't have a strong system of federalism like you would have in America. Ours, as I have explained, is a lot weaker. Certainly, you've got no fiscal powers, you've got no control over the police. And so you're basically left trying to deregulate stuff if you are a liberally minded government. But the countries that have got systems of federalism would include Canada, Australia, the United States. Germany is a big one.
India.
And then finally, India as well. And then finally, the United Kingdom has embarked on a process of devolution that has seen Scotland actually achieve significant powers. And so someone like Nicola Sturgeon is in a far more powerful position than Alan Winde. The governor of Texas in America, the governor of Florida, those guys are in a far more powerful position. There you've got taxation powers, and you've got like the Texas State National Guard, or whatever it's called, which is like a militia at your disposal. Those are the sort of powers that a South African premier would dream of. But I do think that it's not a coincidence that some of the more successful Anglosphere countries, such as Australia and Canada and the United States, have got vibrant and very successful provincial a vibrant and successful provincial sphere of government. And an important point is that the US states actually provides a breeding ground for potential future presidents of the country. Bill Clinton was the governor of Arkansas. Ronald Reagan was the governor of California, and so on. If you look at the upcoming Republicans, Ron DeSantis is there in Florida. And it just provides another dimension to your politics. It allows you it provides for greater contestation of ideas. And I think that's what's missing in South Africa at the moment, across every function of government. We're obsessed with identity politics, we're obsessed with corruption. And you've got to give the DA credit. They've run a provincial administration in the Western Cape that has been on another level entirely compared to the other 8 provinces when it comes to basic competence of governments and in terms of rooting out corruption. And that's great. But what I would like to see from DA provincial governments, potentially in Gauteng as well, is more ambition or far clearer strategy when it comes to pushing the boundaries in respect of the 33 concurrent or 34 concurrent functions of government in the 4th schedule.
Tell us more about your own background and how is it that you became interested in these kind of ideas?
Well, I was a law student at UCT from 2000 and, I did a BCom and an LLB, and so I was at UCT from 2007 to 2011. And we were required to do a mini dissertation in 2010, and Helen Zille had just been elected premier, so I got into the whole issue of provincial legislative powers, and I thought it was really interesting. But also underdeveloped area of law. There were some very good texts, particularly by a woman called Victoria Bronstein. But other than that, I didn't pick up much else in this area, and my professors weren't enormously interested in it either, which is not surprising considering UCT's ideological orientation. But I had also had some wonderful supervision from Richard Callan as well, so I'm very grateful to him. But I then, after UCT, I bumped into Helen Ziller on the side of Whale Street. Believe it or not, and I said, "Listen, I've got this thesis," and she said, "Well, email it to me." So I did, and then next thing I was working as like a researcher intern in the Western Cape government, and I did that for 6 months in 2012. I then went to the UK to study. I did a master's degree at Oxford and a master's degree at Cambridge. And when I was at Cambridge doing a master's of law, you had to do a thesis, and so I took my UCT thesis and I expanded it and developed it. And came back from the UK, got into a law firm, and never really took the work much further. But the Western Cape has always been something I've kept an eye on, and I've always watched what they've done with interest. And so when I saw this referendum bill come out last week, I was very interested to see that, because it was something that I proposed about 10 years ago, but didn't get off the ground. And there's always been a stumbling block, which is how are you going to get the national parliament to enact the law that you need? But it appears they're now grasping the nettle. It appears that they've decided that the calculus of risk is such that they're prepared to take on what is a bit of a risk, calling a provincial referendum. It's going to set the cat amongst the pigeons. And it seems like the DA is getting more assertive when it comes to provincial powers. And other than that, I'm not currently involved in the space at all. Last time I did significant research in this area was nearly 10 years ago, but I have written quite a lot about it. So it stays, fortunately, quite fresh in my memory. Yeah.
Richard Wilkinson, thank you very much for joining me on Solutions with David Ansara. If you're watching on YouTube, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. And if you're listening on your preferred podcast platform, please do leave a 5-star review. I'd be hugely grateful if you could share it to your networks as well. It helps the show to grow. My name is David Ansara. Until next time, take care.